Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Today I'm talking to Gregory Barker, Lord Barker of Battle, as he now is, former Energy and Climate Minister in the UK government. Lord Barker, thank you for joining me today.
Well, great to be here, Kelvin, and thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. We're here to talk about many things, but all against the backdrop of COP26. Now, as a former climate minister in the UK, how did you feel watching the UK host the world's climate talks this year?
Well, there was a bit of nostalgia there, but overwhelmingly, I was very proud. I thought they did a great job. Only a few weeks before COP actually happened, people were still saying, "Can it happen? Should it happen? Will anyone turn up?" Let's not, forget the huge challenges of mounting a conference of that size and scale during a time of COVID. And when I got there, I was frankly blown away by the scale of participation. It was extremely well organized. So logistically, number one, leaving the outcomes aside, it was a real triumph for a well organized, well put together COP, and 10 out of 10 to the UK for having the guts to actually plow on and get it right. In terms of the outcomes, well, we all know we need to do a lot more. I think we have kept 1.5 alive, to coin the phrase, but let's not kid ourselves that unless there's a lot more work in subsequent years from governments, and many more governments increasing the rate of action on decarbonisation, that hope is going to be extinguished pretty quickly. But it's progress. And the most important thing about these meetings is the sense of momentum and energy that they create. And I did get that sense coming away from COP that while the tangible, deliverable outcomes from COP, were good but not overwhelming, and certainly leave a lot more to do, there did seem to be a real sense of momentum now towards that net zero goal. And the biggest example of that was the participation of the private sector. Beforehand, you've had the private sector turn up in force at these meetings, but it's invariably been the green leaders, those who were optimistic about their business's ability to lead the low carbon transition, those who were true believers, as it were, early adopters. But there's a big shift this time, because actually it wasn't dominated by the sort of long time believers, but actually by those who are new, who are coming not because they finally were drinking the climate Kool-Aid, but because they recognized that their risk to their business and to their business model was far greater if they stood on the sidelines and did nothing than if they actually embraced the transition. That's the big shift. Now the private sector is dominated by those who understand the inherent risks of not acting, rather than just those who see the opportunities of being early leaders. And that has meant that the weight of private sector finance, private sector investment, responsible corporate leadership is all now on the side of driving climate action. Mm-hmm. It's no longer a minority sport.
No, not at all. Yeah, you're right. I found the same thing very interesting. Was the not just the participation, but the interaction of the private sector there. And I think because you have a lot of these private sector companies that need to invest and need to be seen to invest in clean energy, but perhaps up until now, and for many of them, maybe still, that they don't quite know where to invest. What is the right thing to do? So that you think that's been more understood and exploited by investors?
Yeah, it's not just they don't know where to invest. It's a lot of them have sat on the sidelines thinking, is it the right time now? Is this something we should take really seriously? Is this corporate window dressing? Does this actually, can we afford to do this now? And I think now they're thinking, oh my goodness, we've got to get with this. Otherwise, our business model is going to become obsolete. If you don't make the transition as a business now to a low carbon model, you will literally not have a future. So I think that there is a healthy degree of panic in the corporate sector, in boardrooms that have historically really ignored this right up to the 2020s and not seen this as a priority, and now are rushing to get with the party. Of course, there are still some outliers. Of course, there's more to do. And the big question is, will all of this movement be commensurate with the scale of change that we need to see? It's not good enough just for everyone to do their best. What we need is to make sure that change happens in a way that is commensurate with the science-based targets that are set out in Paris, which is a very high hurdle to meet. Mm-hmm. And for some of those companies that come late to the party, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. But make no mistake, for everyone, as you start to get closer towards net zero, it's going to be a challenge, and it's going to require unprecedented innovation and unprecedented investment to drive that innovation. So there's big change coming.
Mm-hmm. And behind that, I remember during your time in government, and for years, people used to say policymakers mustn't pick winners. The market will let the market play out, and it will find its own equilibrium. But are we now perhaps at the point where someone somewhere should pick winners, or a selection of winners, to get to where you've just described we need to be?
Well, let's not kid. Everyone loves a winner. It's the losers that people are a bit more worried about. So, if politicians can pick winners, they have no problem. The problem is that politicians' record of picking winners isn't particularly good, and they end up invariably picking losers. So that is the challenge. But serious point, I think while you don't want to try and micromanage the economy, there are some, big decisions that governments can make with the help of sensible analysis of hard data that will help drive their economy towards a low carbon future in the most efficient and low cost way. Good example of that has been the decision that we took when I was in government, in my department, to drive forward the expansion of offshore wind by creating a market-based framework to encourage investment, but also at the same time, through having a competitive tender for the subsidy, to also encourage highly efficient deployment of public subsidy. And as a result, we have the world's largest offshore wind industry in the UK, and it has outperformed even the biggest optimist expectations. It's a tremendous example of British ingenuity, government policy, and city investment working hand in hand. But we need to replicate that in other technologies. We need to replicate that in other industries and right across the whole economy. But the energy sector, I think, is going into a very exciting period of profound change, driven by innovation, and innovation which is being fundamentally driven by government policy rather than the natural order of things.
You talked about industry there. You are executive chairman of a low carbon aluminium manufacturer, Enlit Group. Is the in terms of decarbonising industry, is the metals industry doing all it can to decarbonise, or is it doing the best it can, or does it need any help? And if it does need help, who does it need that help from?
Short answer, no, it's not. I can only really speak for the aluminium sector, where there is huge opportunity and huge potential, but a lot more needs to be done, not just by us, but by our competitors as well, in order to drive forward this sector so that it can help the global economy transform into a low carbon model as soon as possible. The reason I say that is that aluminium is a critical material for the low carbon economy of the future. It's essential for electric vehicles, for sustainable packaging, for energy infrastructure, renewable energy infrastructure. 85% of a solar panel installation is actually made up of aluminium. It's infinitely recyclable. About 70% of all the aluminium that's ever been made in modern industrial history is still in circulation, but we need to get that up to 100%. And we need to take aluminium, which is an incredibly energy intensive process to create. We need to take that metal and make it solely with renewable energy, or clean energy. So at the N Plus Group, we're not just the world's largest producer of low carbon aluminium. We're also the world's largest private sector hydropower company. To put that in some context, we produce some 16 gigawatts of hydro electricity, of which the lion's share goes to power our smelting business. But 16 gigawatts, to put that in context, it's 2 gigawatts for the Hoover Dam, and we have 16. Our fleet of hydro assets produces more electricity than the UK's nuclear power stations put together. It's a massive clean energy resource, but we have to ensure that we are getting the maximum from it, which is why we're continuing to invest, while we have a modernization program. For some of our assets date back to the 1960s, others are much newer. But we're constantly investing and trying to find new technical solutions to squeeze every ounce of efficiency out of those installations.
It's interesting you talk about hydropower because, as you say, it's the most conventional of all the renewables. It's been around for years. It's tried and tested, and yet in the discussions about the energy transition and moving to renewables, it's almost left out. No one. It seems to fly under the radar.
I think there's a good reason for that, because in the 80s and 90s there were some very controversial new build hydropower projects which weren't built to the highest environmental standards. The impact on their local environment, particularly in whether you're building in rainforest or parts of China, was very significant. And there's always a trade-off when with most energy installations. Nothing happens in a vacuum. But I think some of those big projects in the 1980s and 90s did have a very unfortunate environmental footprint. However, in part due to the backlash from what you might call before people were talking about climate change with any real volume, from environmental campaigners, the new generation of hydro power producers, I think, have realized that the broader environmental credentials really do matter. Certainly at M+, we take that incredibly seriously and see ourselves as custodians of Lake Baikal, where we are really environmental stewards. But the reality is you can only build hydro where it's appropriate. And there are a number of places where schemes have been attempted where it isn't appropriate. But if you get those broader environmental dynamics right, it is a massive, reliable source of clean energy. And certainly there is a lot more potential around the world. But it has to be done sensibly and to the highest possible environmental standards. And that's what we've got to do. So, yes, I'm a great advocate of what you might call next generation hydro, where you have the highest possible environmental standards, but you're also creating clean energy, baseload clean energy, that works very well alongside other intermittent renewables.
You're also an advocate for microgrids. You're involved in a company called PowerHive that brings microgrids to Africa. How much of a conundrum is it for in that situation where you have to bring electricity for the first time to make sure you go down the renewables road and don't go down the quick fix fossil fuel road?
Well, it's not so much as a conundrum as you might think, because certainly for many of the rural poor that we're reaching at PowerHive, they don't have access to the grid. It's not yet reached them. There are hundreds of millions of people in Africa who don't have access to the grid, and for whom the opportunity for decentralized microgrid solutions offer not just a quicker solution, and a more sustainable solution, but can actually be cost effective as well. And we're now finding at Power Hive that we're combining the opportunity to have village-based microgrids using solar that's plummeted in cost, making it much more affordable to low-income communities. And we're combining that with e-mobility, so electric bikes, which are charged from the solar installations that we have in those villages. And it's a very exciting combination, bringing power and mobility to rural communities that have historically only had one option if they wanted to improve their economic livelihood, and that was to migrate to large cities. This is a really sustainable model of economic growth in an environmentally friendly way. So I think, I've always been a big believer in the power of decentralized energy as well. And to see it in action, helping communities in Africa is something I'm very excited by.
And we're almost out of time, so I have one more question. If between now and COP next year in Europe, if you could see one thing happening that would make a significant positive change, what would it be?
Carbon pricing. The one thing that I haven't mentioned, I also chair the World Bank's carbon pricing initiative, the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. And I think Glasgow has created some real momentum around the need to harmonize carbon pricing and bring that back to the center of the argument of how we drive towards a low carbon economy. There are over 45 different carbon prices, as many as 60 potentially out there. We don't need one global price on carbon, but we do need to harmonize it. And certainly in advanced economies like the EU and North America, by 2030, it's got to be up there at $100 or more. And to make that happen, we need to make sure that we harmonize and have common standards and systems to allow that to happen effectively. Because if you do have a global price on carbon, you won't have so many tariffs or obstructions at the border to these markets. So the only reason that we have a carbon border adjustment mechanism now being worked up is because there is unfair competition from economies that don't put a price on carbon coming in to compete with European companies and businesses that are putting a price on carbon. And the more you can harmonize that, the less need there is for trade barriers. Because ultimately, what I believe in is green free trade.
Absolutely. Well, Barker, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your time today. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Great to see you.